Ying Staton, thank you so much for joining us here. It's the end of Doha Forum, your first Doha Forum.
Yes.
Give me a little wrap-up of your experience so far.
I think, as we were saying before, it's just incredible to be in a large-scale in-person event again. And I think the energy and the dynamism of actually being in there in person and seeing people has been quite incredible. And I've actually felt myself to be quite moved by some of the speakers that I've seen. So yes, all in all, an amazing experience.
Wonderful. Do you think that a couple of years away from these kind of global conferences where people can come together helps us to remind ourselves of the value?
Yes, absolutely. And I think particularly when you're building new relationships and you're meeting people for the first time, there is no substitute for having that in-person contact, and also when you're having difficult conversations, which I think has been the theme of several of the topics here. That's also the proximity and the eye contact and the human touch of it is so important. Yeah,
that's a really nice point. A lot of the topics, it feels like a heavy time to be having conversations with people, but I think that makes a big difference. One of the big topics, which it has been and will continue to be, is obviously around climate. Tell us a little bit about Plastic Energy. I don't want to set you up wrong, but you have a solution to our plastic problem.
We like to think so.
Tell us a little bit about it.
So Plastic Energy is a market leader in the advanced recycling of end-of-life plastic waste. And by that I mean we take mixed contaminated plastic waste that's been commingled with your household waste. So these are your crisp packets, plastic bags, and through a proprietary process, we can convert that plastic back into a recycled oil. And that oil can be used as a direct substitute for virgin fossil fuels in existing petrochemical infrastructure to make recycled plastic that has identical qualities as new plastic. So that basically means that you can capture waste plastic as a resource and use that resource to diversify away from virgin fossil fuel feedstocks. And in addition, what you're doing at the same time is tackling plastic pollution in our environment and in our oceans, which is clearly another very pressing issue that we face today.
Wow. The implications of this sound is quite massive. So tell me if you can, sort of very briefly, where the research of this idea came from, and how are you capturing this waste? What's the process?
Yes. So I think if you look at the overall context of the global demand for oil and gas, for hydrocarbons, notwithstanding the short to medium term disruption in the energy markets that's been exacerbated by what's happening in Ukraine, over the next coming decades, you'll see that the demand for hydrocarbons as a fuel will decline, but that will be more than offset by the demand for fossil fuel as a feedstock to make plastic. And the demand for plastic is really directly correlated with demographics, with GDP growth, because if you think about it, plastic is completely integral to modern life. So from the PPE and the masks that we've all become so accustomed to during the pandemic, to the plastic packaging that helps to extend the shelf life of food, to the sachets of soap that are helping to improve health and sanitation outcomes in remote parts of Indonesia. It's very difficult to get rid of plastic altogether. And of course, we believe that plastic should be used responsibly and we should use less of it where possible. But at the same time, why don't we try to capture all of that waste plastic that is being generated? And what if it could be possible to decouple the production of plastic from the extraction of virgin fossil fuels? And then by capturing that waste plastic, what we can do is to turn it into a renewable resource that can be used over and over again to make new plastics. But of course, to get there, it's not a simple solution. The technology is only one part of it. But actually, as a business, what we find the most difficult challenge is really the waste management system. And you see plastic waste everywhere, it's polluting our beaches, our oceans, but actually in practice, it's very difficult to access the plastic in a way which makes it viable for a recycling business such as ours. And that comes back to the waste management system. And I've been talking a lot, so maybe I'll pause there.
No, that's fantastic. And I assume that the ways you have to interact with all nations is different as well. So there's a policy level, I assume. And the thing that I find fascinating about this topic is obviously with all things related to the climate challenge, we have the sort of negatives of it disproportionately affect those who are sort of the least responsible
Absolutely.
for it. And particularly, I think, when we talk about oceans.
Yes.
So if I'm a small island nation, what's the benefit for me? Can you sort of characterize what that is if we start being able to utilize this technology in sort of major markets around the world?
Yes, so I think there are two aspects to this. One, as you say, there has been a huge equity problem around the way that developed countries have basically chosen to outsource their waste and to send plastic to less developed countries without infrastructure and with lesser financial resources to tackle that plastic waste. Thankfully, the Basel Convention and other efforts over recent years has reduced this global shipment of plastic waste, but we're still seeing it happen in practice. And fundamentally, when you have leakage of plastic into the ocean, it does affect countries. Some of the small island nations that you were referring to, other countries like Indonesia with a lot of coastline. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think the second one is that when you then talk to some environmental campaigners who say that we think the problem is plastic and we want to ban plastic altogether, that also disproportionately affects the developing countries and the nations who are at the very end of logistical and supply chains, who really depend on the plastic in order to be able to get fresh food and health and sanitation products. So to say that we should stop using plastic as a world is also going to disproportionately impact those developing countries. So what we think is that we need to build a system where the incentives are baked in for any plastic that is used to be disposed of in the right way. And the best way is for it to be segregated from the rest of your domestic waste. Because if you take your plastic bag, your crisp packet, whatever it is, and you put it in a dedicated bin, and you collect enough of it, it's actually relatively easy to recycle it. The technology is not that complicated. The problem is that in most parts of the world, we don't do that. And once the plastic gets commingled with your organics and your food and your liquids, it becomes very expensive and difficult to extract it for recycling. So if we can get the system upstream set up in the right way and incentivize households and waste management companies and local authorities to actually segregate plastic and other types of waste, it applies to other types of waste as well, where if you segregate it, you can find a way to recover the value from it. Then I think we can see a system where we can still enjoy all of the benefits of plastic, but without facing the problem of plastic pollution as we have today. And at the same time, it has the added advantage, which I think is very relevant for hydrocarbon-rich countries like those states in the Gulf, that we're helping to diversify the petrochemical industry and these economies away from a dependence on virgin fossil fuels, whilst making the best use of the existing physical and human capital that they already have in the industry to build a circular economy.
Perfect. And how receptive have they been? I mean, not just these nations, but all nations, particularly energy creating nations, is the end of the day. How receptive have they been to this discussion? Because the thing I find fascinating exactly about what you've just said there is we're talking not only from an innovation perspective, but also a very big behavioral element that creates a lot of work, and this differs by culture, by age, by demographic. So how receptive are the governments to what you're talking about and what your company is trying to do?
Yes, so I think that's a very good question because fundamentally what drives the development of technologies, what drives markets, in the end comes down to public policy and to behavior. And behavior can also be changed by public policy. And when we talk to policymakers, they all like the idea of a circular economy. And they say, what can we do to get you to come and invest in a recycling facility in our country? But the difficult part is that it's not that simple because what we're trying to do is actually to disrupt the way that the existing waste management system works, and in a way disrupting the way that the existing petrochemical supply chain works. And whenever you have disruption, you have winners and losers, and it is difficult to create a consensus upon which to move forward. And that's where we need far-sighted thinking and from policymakers who understand that if they want to see recycling, they have to change the waste management system. And in a country like Singapore, where I live at the moment, for example, the difficulty there is that the government has, for several decades, developed in some ways, very successful policy of incinerating all of their waste. But incineration has its limitations. It's very energy intensive, it generates a lot of emissions, and it's actually generating residue, which is stored in a landfill in Singapore, and the space is running out. And we very much believe that incineration is not the right solution, because what you should be doing is to separate the different waste streams so that you can recover the value.
Yeah.
You can recycle the plastics, recycle the paper, the metal, and then the organics. You can compost or turn into biogas, but that's only possible if you have segregation at source. And for Singapore, the challenge is that when you build this incineration capacity, you build it for 10, 20, 30 years. So the plants that have just been commissioned, they have a very long life. So to go to the government and say, we want you to change the way that works when they've invested billions in building this infrastructure is very difficult. So it has to be a gradual process, and you start with small steps, but I think it's really important to have the ambition that's very clear, and to be very predictable and very consistent in the way that you make policy in order to create the right foundations for these investments to be made.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm eager to know, just to contextualize the conversation we're having, where are we globally down the line of this sort of plastic crisis that we're having? If you can sort of briefly contextualize that, just so we can get a sense of exactly what we're dealing with.
Yeah. So one very often used statistic that I think came from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation is that by 2050, there'll be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And this is because plastic, it's the qualities that make it very useful, it's very durable, also means that it sticks around in the environment for a very long time. And the reality is that the majority of that leakage into the oceans is coming from emerging economies, less developed countries in Southeast Asia. A lot of it is coming from China, from India. And these are the countries which are less equipped to invest in and to build the kinds of waste collection and management systems that would prevent this from happening. So I think my view is that it could get worse before it gets better. Because it really takes time to invest in these systems. And it's not just about building the infrastructure, it's about changing the whole ecosystem, changing policy, changing behavior. But ultimately, I think that there is a path forward. We have the technology, we now have a lot of public awareness and political commitment. And I think the finance is also coming into this space. So we need to bring all of those things together and help to educate all of the stakeholders about what's required. But I think ultimately the solution is not to get rid of plastic altogether, because first of all, what would you replace it with? But really to try to find a way to manage it responsibly, and where possible to bring it back into a circular economy as a renewable resource.
Wonderful. And then just to finish, do you have, where are you progressing the most? Where can you look to and say, okay, this is our case study, this is where we're making progress from a behavioral perspective, from an infrastructure perspective, financing, whatever it might be?
The EU has definitely been the leader in this area, and over the past decade, they've implemented a tranche of circular economy directives, and these include measures like banning plastic from landfill and extended producer responsibility schemes, which put the onus back on the producers of plastic to fund the collection of recycling of that plastic. And I think also on the demand side, they've also implemented legislation like requiring minimum recycled content in packaging. And the UK has implemented a similar tax on virgin plastics. And these types of measures really help to create demand for our product. So I think if you can have a combination of the supply side measures that make landfilling and incineration less attractive, and then the demand side measures which create demand for the recycled product, with the combination of those types of policies, then we'll really see an opportunity for this industry to flourish. So it started in the EU, but I'm seeing growing interest to follow in the EU's footsteps from other countries like Korea, Singapore, even Japan, and I think other countries in Southeast Asia like Indonesia and Malaysia, who are all thinking about how to manage the plastics problem. And I hope it's something that we'll also start to see in the GCC.
Wonderful. I mean, I guess when you start to be able to talk about it at that policy level, that maybe takes the onus a little bit off the individual as well. Because I feel with plastic, it's been quite easy in the past for the individuals to feel as though they're the problem, right? You've got this idea that if you're not using a bamboo toothbrush, you're destroying the world, and that just seems very unrealistic to me. And I suppose this helps to alleviate that, and I suppose that will help get the public behind these kind of policies, which is very important as well, right? A topic
Absolutely.
where we need individuals and governments and big business to be working together.
Yeah, I think the recycling industry, one of the ways that it's failed is in keeping trust with the public.
Sure.
And I think what you've seen in the US, for example, is a huge public backlash against the concept of recycling, because there are rightly environmental groups who point out that whatever you put in your recycling bin is probably not being recycled. And you even saw Boris Johnson saying, okay, recycling doesn't work, we should just stop using plastic altogether. But my response to that is, it is a reality that recycling today is limited and doesn't work and isn't practiced as much as it should be. But that's because the system is not set up to enable recycling. It would be like 20 years ago saying that renewables don't work. Of course, renewables couldn't work without the kinds of consistent, predictable policy support, the subsidies, the investment that made the system possible and made it possible for renewables to genuinely compete with fossil fuels. And we need the same in recycling. We need to make that investment to build the ecosystem, the policies, the infrastructure. And it is possible. The technology is there, the science is there. What needs to change is policy and behavior. And I think what individuals can do, of course, we should all be more responsible in the way that we consume and the way that we dispose of waste. But fundamentally, I think that the most effective thing would be to keep up the pressure on policymakers to make the difficult decisions and to build these types of solutions.